It was the spring of 1872, when the high desert of the Arizona Territory still carried more ghosts than names, and a dry wind whispered tales too old for most ears to bear. Out where the saguaro cacti stood like sentinels and the red rock cliffs cradled the sun each morning, a girl named Nantan Luyu, a name meaning strong heart in her tongue, moved through the wild brush like a shadow made of smoke. She was Apache, born of the White Mountain people, with eyes dark as the new moon and hair that fell to her waist like a black river. She knew every twist of that canyon, every hollow where coyotes made their dens, every path where snakes curled to warm in the morning sun. And it was on one of those paths that fate came riding hard, half dead and full of bullet holes. The man was slumped over his saddle, blood painting the dust a sickly rust color beneath him. His horse, a bay mustang lathered in sweat, staggered to a stop near the dry wash, where Nantan had come to fill her canteen. She froze, one hand to the hilt of her knife, the other already testing the wind. He didn't speak at first, didn't even groan, just pitched sideways and hit the ground with a grunt that sounded more animal than man. She approached slow, like one would a wounded coyote, careful, quiet, and ready to run. He was older, white-skinned, with a thick coat draped over what once must have been fine clothes. A silver chain hung from his vest, glinting beneath blood and dust. A cattle baron, she guessed. She'd heard the old ones speak of such men, rich folk who carved up the land with wire and steel and claimed it as theirs by deed and law. But this man was no lord of the land now. He was dying. She knelt beside him, pressed her fingers to his neck. The beat was there, faint, fluttering like a moth in a storm. His eyes blinked open then, startling black with pain. "Water," he rasped. She hesitated. The Apaches had no love for settlers, less still for cattlemen who pushed the herds across sacred ground. But there was something in his eyes that caught her. Not fear, not anger, something hollow. She tilted her canteen and let the water fall slow into his mouth. He choked once, coughed, then breathed deep like a man who wasn't ready to meet the other side just yet. "You're Apache?" he asked, voice thin as paper. She nodded, silent. He blinked hard, as if trying to see her through a haze of memory. "Then I reckon it's fitting." "Fitting for what?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. His eyes rolled back slightly, and he coughed again, worse this time, deep, wet, and full of blood. But he gritted through it and said, "There's a letter in my coat. You take it. Give it to the boy in Prescott. Name's Whit." But the last word never came. She sat there, listening to the wind rap round the rocks like a mourning hymn. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. She reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of parchment, blood-stained at the corners, sealed with a signet ring pressed into red wax. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. This was a man with unfinished business. And now, by some twist of fate, that business was hers to carry. What she didn't know was that this moment, this dying breath of a cattle baron whose name she'd never heard, was about to change not just her path, but the whole of Arizona itself. Nantan Luyu wrapped the dead man in his own coat, left his boots on out of respect, and built a cairn of red stone atop his resting place. The desert didn't leave much behind but bones and stories, and she aimed to give him at least one of those. She didn't know his name, but she'd carry his letter like it was fire. She'd made camp that night beneath a leaning mesquite tree, fire low, embers dancing like spirits in the dark. The letter sat in her satchel, untouched. The cattleman had said Prescott, and she'd heard of the town. White stone buildings, soldiers in blue coats, and more fences than sky. A dangerous place for Apache feet, but a promise made beside a dying man held weight, heavier than iron. Morning came with the cry of a lynx, sharp, sudden, close. She rose fast, bow in hand, ears tuned. There, by the edge of camp, a lean wildcat stared back at her, gold eyes like coins in a gambler's hand. For a breath, neither moved. Then it turned and vanished into the brush. She watched the place where it had stood, heart thumping steady. In her people's way, such creatures were omens, messengers, guardians. She took it for what it was, a sign. Her path was chosen. 2 days she traveled, skirting the edge of the high country, avoiding white settlements, soldiers, and silver mines. Her food dwindled to dried mesquite beans and wild onion, and she drank from muddy creeks when the canteen ran dry. The letter never left her side. It was on the third day, near dusk, that trouble found her. A rider approached from the west, silhouetted by the setting sun. She dropped low, eyes narrowing. White man, tall in the saddle, rifle across his back, and a coil of rope on the horn. A bounty hunter by the look of him. He didn't see her, not right away. She waited, still as stone. But his horse caught her scent, or maybe just sensed the tension, because it stopped, ears pricked. The man followed its gaze and spotted her crouched in the yucca. "Well now," he drawled, grinning like a coyote. "What do we have here?" She stood slow, bow still in hand. "I don't want trouble." "Funny," he said, dismounting. "You look like it anyhow." He moved with the kind of swagger that came from easy kills and quick hangings. She could smell whiskey on him even from where she stood. "You one of them White Mountain girls?" he asked, circling. "Got a price on your kind down Tucson way?" "I ain't for sale." "That's so." His hand moved toward his belt. Her arrow flew faster. It caught him in the thigh, not deep, but enough to drop him to one knee with a howl. His revolver hit the dirt before he could aim it. She was on him in a blink, boot to his chest, knife to his throat. "I got no wish to kill you," she said, low and steady, "but I'll bury you if I must." He looked up, mouth open to speak, maybe to beg, but what she saw in his eyes stopped her. Recognition. You got his letter," he gasped. "Baron Whitlock. I saw you ride from the gulch. That paper's worth more than silver." Her knife pressed tighter. "How do you know him?" "I worked his herd long time ago. Left after the range war. But I heard things about a son, about land tied up in trust. That letter," he winced, blood dripping into the dust. "It's the key." She stepped back. He didn't follow. "You best ride the long way to Prescott," he spat, pain thick in his voice. "Plenty of folks'll want that letter for themselves." She said nothing, just gathered her bow, turned, and walked into the dark. Behind her, the bounty hunter's curses faded into the wind. Ahead lay Prescott, and destiny. Prescott rose from the earth like a wound. Stone buildings crouched behind timber walls, smoke curling from chimneys, and soldiers leaning lazy against iron-barred gates. The town had a smell to it. Sweat, gun oil, and fresh sawdust, with something sour beneath, like old greed. Nantan Luyu stood at the edge of town with dust on her boots and the letter in her satchel, hood drawn low over her face. Her bow and knife were stashed in a hollow stump outside the west road. No Apache walked into Prescott armed and walked back out again. The streets were crowded that morning. Ranchers, traders, gamblers in dusty coats, and girls in frilled skirts. Somewhere, a piano tinkled out a broken tune, but she kept her head down and walked with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't aim to stay long. The cattle baron had said to give the letter to the boy in Prescott. She figured that meant kin, son or nephew maybe. Problem was, names were scarcer than rain. She needed help, and help in a place like Prescott had a price. She found it in the form of a woman named Mora Finch, owner of the Gilded Stag, a saloon with gold trim and eyes in every corner. Mora was tall, sharp as barbed wire, and had a laugh that never quite reached her eyes. "You don't look like you got coin," Mora said, arms crossed as she eyed Nantan from behind the bar. "I need a name," Nantan replied. "Boy tied to the Whitlock family. I have a letter for him." Mora arched a brow. "Whitlock, huh? Thought that whole line was buried in Tombstone or drunk dry by now." She poured herself a whiskey, sipped it slow. "You got the letter?" Nantan didn't answer. "That's wise," Mora said, nodding. "'Cause if word gets out you're carrying something from Everett Whitlock, there'll be a dozen men with sharp knives and crooked deeds looking to take it." "You know the boy or not?" Nantan asked. Mora leaned in, her voice a hush. "Name's Elias. Elias Whitlock. Works the forge now, down near Smoke Alley. Used to be mean as a rattler, but grief softened him some." "Grief? His old man," Mora said, sliding the empty glass away. "Disappeared near Black Mesa last week. They say Apaches took him. Nantan's jaw clenched. He wasn't taken. He was dying. Mora blinked, reading her face. You saw him. Nantan said nothing. Mora nodded again. Well then, I reckon it's time Elias heard the truth. The forge was at the edge of the freight yard, a squat stone building with smoke belching from its chimney, and the sound of hammer on iron echoing like thunder. Inside, Elias Whitlock stood shirtless at the anvil, muscles slick with sweat, dark hair damp against his brow. He was younger than she expected, maybe 20, maybe less, but the way he held the hammer said he'd known loss. His eyes, deep and shadowed, met hers when she stepped through the door. You look lost, he said. No, she replied, but I have something that belongs to you. She pulled the letter from her satchel, the red wax cracked but still bearing the cattleman's signet. His eyes dropped to it. His face turned pale. Where'd you get that? He asked, voice hollow. Your father gave it to me. He's dead. The hammer slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a dull clang. She told him everything. How she found him. How he died. How he asked for the letter to be delivered. Elias stood silent through it all, jaw tight, hands trembling. When she finished, he opened the letter. What he read made him curse under his breath. Then he looked at her and said, This changes everything. And just like that, the storm began to roll. Elias didn't speak for a long time after reading the letter. He just stood there, the parchment trembling in his hands, the fire of the forge behind him casting shadows on the walls like restless ghosts. Nantan Luyu watched him carefully. She'd seen grief before, its many shapes, its bitter flavors. But what she saw in Elias was something sharper, realization. My father was a hard man, he said at last, voice low and bitter. But he was no fool. If he wrote this, it means everything he told me growing up, about the ranch, the trust, the land rights. It was all a lie, or a half-truth, which is worse. What does the letter say? She asked. Elias turned the page toward the light. It says I'm not just his son, I'm his heir. The whole Whitlock range, it's mine now. He'd kept the deed under a false name all these years, hid it to protect it from men who wanted it for themselves. There's mention of a vault, too, in the Prescott Bank. He looked up, jaw set hard. If this letter reaches the bank manager, the land transfers officially. But, she asked, there's others who won't want that. My father made enemies, men who made their fortunes when he got sick and stepped away from the business. This letter changes the game, and they'll do anything to keep that from happening. Nantan nodded. One tried already. Elias raised a brow. She told him about the bounty hunter, the ambush, the mention of the letter's worth. He cursed under his breath. Then we have to move fast, he said. Bank opens at first light. You come with me. She hesitated. This was your father's wish. I've done what I was asked. I need someone I can trust, he said. And I don't know many people who would ride into Prescott just to hand a man his future. Nantan studied him. The blacksmith's calluses on his hands. The weight he carried that had nothing to do with muscle. She nodded once. All right, she said. At first light. That night, they made camp in the abandoned smithy's loft. Elias cooked beans and cornbread on a small stove, and Nantan shared dried venison from her pouch. They didn't speak much, just listened to the wind creak through the boards and the soft hiss of cooling metal below. Before sleep, Elias said, Thank you for bringing it to me, for not keeping it or burning it or selling it off. I didn't do it for you, she said plainly. I know, he said with a small smile. But you did it anyway. When dawn came, the sky over Prescott bled crimson, and smoke drifted from the chimneys like warnings. They walked to the bank, with boots quiet on cobblestone, the town waking around them. Inside the bank, the manager, a pinched man with spectacles and a nervous mustache, took the letter with trembling hands. Everett Whitlock's signet, he whispered, running his fingers over the wax. My stars, this is real. This changes everything. As he rifled through papers behind the counter, a shadow passed across the bank's window. Nantan's eyes caught the glint of sunlight off a rifle barrel across the street. Down, she shouted, pulling Elias to the floor as glass shattered around them. Gunfire erupted, and just like that, all hell broke loose. The bank windows exploded inward, glass raining down like angry hail. Nantan hit the ground first, dragging Elias with her behind the heavy desk. The bank manager screamed and scurried toward the back room, clutching the deed, like it might shield him from bullets. The first volley of gunfire came wild, warning shots meant to panic. But the second round was precise, calculated. Someone wanted Elias Whitlock dead before his name was inked in any ledger. Nantan peeked over the desk. Two men across the street, rifles propped on barrels outside the saloon. Another on the bank's roof, silhouetted against the morning sun. Hired guns, likely from the Hollis brothers, old rivals of Everett Whitlock who'd been circling like buzzards since the old man's health began to fail. "We're trapped," Elias muttered, blood trickling from a scrape on his temple. "We're not dead," Nantan said, already scanning the bank's layout. "Means we still gotta play." A pistol hung from the bank manager's coat rack, ornamental, but loaded. She took it. Elias armed himself with a ledger book and a brass letter opener. More resolve than weapon, but it'd have to do. They crawled to the rear vault as bullets punched holes through the front desk. The back room was small, locked, but Elias knew the trick. His father had once shown him the pattern to the old safe, a rattlesnake coil engraved into the edge. With shaking hands, he twisted the dial, listening for clicks. Outside, the town had erupted. Folks screamed and scattered. Some ducked behind barrels, others peeked from windows, curious to see who'd live and who'd bleed. The safe opened with a heavy groan. Inside, papers, gold coins, and a ledger marked Whitlock Holdings. Atop them, a map, yellowed and brittle, with a thick black X scratched into the Black Mesa Range. Elias's hand hovered over it. "That's what they're after. That land." Nantan's eyes narrowed. "What's out there?" He shook his head. "Only Pa knew. Just called it the claim. Said it would change everything." They didn't have long to ponder it. A lantern flew through the shattered window, trailing flame. It landed near the front desk. Nantan moved like lightning. She grabbed the kerosene-soaked rag, flung it back out the window before it caught. A bullet nicked the frame an inch from her hand. "We can't hold him here," Elias said, voice tight. "Then we don't," she replied. "We move." The rear of the bank backed onto a narrow alley. Nantan led the way, pistol drawn. Elias behind with the documents clutched tight. They burst through the side door and ran into the rising smoke. One of the gunmen saw them and shouted. Another fired, a shot that clipped the edge of Nantan's sleeve, burning the cloth. She ducked and returned fire, twice. One shot found its mark. The man fell without a sound. The alley twisted through crates and rain barrels. They reached the livery yard, horses whinnying in panic. Elias threw a saddle over a black gelding, Nantan mounting a dun mare already half crazed by the noise. "They won't stop," Elias said, breath ragged. "No," she agreed, "but we ride anyway." They galloped out of Prescott like a dust devil, hooves churning dirt, bullets trailing behind like wasps with nowhere to sting. Behind them, the town faded into smoke and screams. Ahead lay Black Mesa, and the truth buried in the claim. They rode hard through the low country, hooves throwing up trails of red dust that vanished behind them like smoke signals. For 3 days and 2 restless nights, Elias and Nantan Luyu followed the old cattle roads etched into the land by years of hoof and boot. They stayed clear of towns, slept beneath the stars, and kept their rifles close, even when they closed their eyes. The claim, according to the map, lay deep within Black Mesa, a land of steep canyons and silent stone, sacred to Nantan's people and whispered about in old trader tongues. "Not many go in," she said. Rein slack in her hands as they reached the mesa's edge. "Fewer come out." Elias nodded, adjusting the satchel with the deed. "Then we'll make sure we're not counted among the missing." The trail narrowed into a cleft barely wide enough for the horses. Dry wind howled between the walls, like a wounded animal. Birds circled high above, silent. Below, nothing moved. They reached a plateau, by sundown, flat, cracked rock overlooking a valley speckled with juniper and mesquite. There, half buried in stone, they found it. A door. Old timber bound in iron, scorched along the edges as if it had once held back fire. Carved into the frame was a mark, the same coiled rattlesnake from the Whitlock crest. "This was no mine," Elias murmured, running his fingers over the weathered carving. "This was sealed." Nantan crouched beside it, brushing away dirt and old bone. This place was defended. Elias found a rusted latch, half hidden under an outcropping. It took both their strength to pull the door open, hinges shrieking like tortured metal. Inside, the air was cool, stale. They stepped into darkness. The chamber was carved from the rock itself, an old Apache cavern once, maybe, now turned into something else. Inside were crates, barrels, and a ledger nailed to the wall. Elias lit a lantern. Its light flickered over rows of dynamite, rifles and oilcloth, gold coins stacked in cigar boxes, and behind it all maps, dozens of them, survey records, water rights, claims. His voice was a whisper. He wasn't hiding treasure. He was hiding a revolution. Nantan walked slowly through the chamber, fingertips brushing the crates. Your father, he was preparing for war. Elias swallowed hard. Not just war. He was preparing to take Arizona back from the rail companies, from the cattle lords who bleed men dry. He had enough here to fund a militia, enough leverage to turn the territory on its head. She turned to him. "And now you hold that future in your hands." He looked down at the deed, the bank seal now dry and permanent. "I didn't ask for this," he said. "No one does," she replied. "But it's yours." Suddenly, a crack echoed through the canyon. Gunfire. A shout. They rushed to the door, just in time to see dust rising on the far ridge. 5 riders. The Hollis gang. One of them held a spyglass. He'd seen them. "Looks like we got company," Elias muttered. Nantan checked her pistol, then pulled her bow from her back. "Then let's show them they didn't ride far enough." The canyon would decide their fate now. The sound of hooves echoed through the stone gorge like a war drum. Dust curled off the ridge where the Hollis riders descended, rifles raised and ready. They came fast, like wolves on a scent, their eyes gleaming with greed and bloodthirst. Elias and Nantan crouched behind the stone lip, just outside the chamber's door, the cash sealed once more behind them. Elias gripped his father's old revolver with white knuckles. Nantan had already knocked an arrow, her body still, breath slow. "You sure you can hit him from here?" Elias asked. She didn't look at him. "I only need to hit one. The rest'll feel it." The first rider rounded the bend. Thwip! An arrow buried itself in the man's chest. He tumbled from the saddle before his gun cleared leather, hitting the ground with a lifeless thud. The others scattered, diving for cover. One fired wildly, the shot ricocheting off rock a foot from Elias's head. "Stay low," Nantan shouted. She moved like a spirit, slipping between stone, firing from shadow. Another rider fell, his mount rearing in panic and bolting down the path. 3 remained. Elias waited until one edged too close, then rose and fired once. The bullet took the man in the thigh. He screamed, dropped his rifle, and crawled behind a juniper stump. "That's 3, Nantan said, breath tight. The last 2 came together, crouching low and using the terrain. One had a shotgun. The other wore a brown duster and a black Stetson, a man with a long scar that split his lip and made every word look like a sneer. "Wes Hollis." "That's the one," Elias muttered. "The ringleader." Hollis raised his head, smiled wide, and shouted, "Whitlock, you hand me that deed, and I'll let you keep your girl. Keep your life, too, if you ask real nice." Elias glanced at Nantan. "He thinks you're mine." She rolled her eyes. "Let him think." Hollis stepped out from behind the rock, shotgun lowered slightly, but his eyes were sharp. "You ain't gonna win this," he called. "That land belongs to the rail, and the rail belongs to us. You think your daddy died of sickness? Nah, we made sure of it." Elias's jaw tightened. "You poisoned him." "Wasn't personal," Hollis said with a shrug. "Just business." A sound rose behind him then, low, rhythmic, like thunder from far off. Hoofbeats. Not one horse. Many. Riders crested the ridge behind the Hollis gang. Cowboys in rough coats and patched hats. At the front rode a woman with a scar across her chin and a sawed-off shotgun in her lap, Mora Finch. I heard there was a debt to settle, she shouted, her grin fierce as a lynx. Thought I'd collect in person. Wes Hollis spun, eyes wide. Before he could move, Mora fired. The scattershot tore through his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The last rider dropped his weapon. Nantan and Elias rose slowly. You bring an army? He asked, breathless. Not quite, Mora said, riding up. But I brought the boys your father once paid. Men who don't forget loyalty. She tipped her hat toward Nantan. Word travels fast when an Apache girl walks into a bank and keeps her promise. Elias looked at Nantan. You saved my land, and maybe more than that. She looked back toward the canyon, toward the sealed chamber behind them. Your land's just the beginning, she said. The sun dipped behind Black Mesa as the last echoes of gunfire faded. The air held the bitter scent of gunpowder and dust, and buzzards already circled overhead. Mora's men rounded up the surviving Hollis riders, binding their hands with saddle rope. Wes Hollis lay where he'd fallen, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his mouth twisted in a snarl. Mora rode up beside him and nudged his ribs with her boot. You had your run, Wes. Now you'll answer to something heavier than lead law. He spat, then laughed through bloodied teeth. Law don't reach men like me. Mora's shotgun cocked with a click. That's 'cause men like you keep shooting the messengers. They left him bound to a fence post with a pair of riders guarding him, then turned toward the sealed chamber. Elias stood before the old door, the deed tight in his hand, the weight of generations pressing down. Mora dismounted beside him. You gonna open that vault to the world? Elias looked down at the map, then at Nantan. Not yet. First, I've got to make sure it stays out of the wrong hands. They rode back to Prescott under cover of night, their return greeted by flickering lanterns and hushed whispers. The town was different now, quieter, like it was holding its breath. News of the ambush and the firefight had spread like prairie fire. Elias Whitlock had survived, and with him, something stronger than gold, a future. At the bank, the manager fumbled to relight the oil lamps when he saw them enter. You again, he stammered. I wasn't expecting. Where's your notary? Elias asked flatly. He handed over the deed and the letter. The bank clerk's hands trembled as he stamped the papers. A signature here, another there. The Whitlock land was now his, bound by ink and law. Outside, the sky began to pale with the first blush of dawn. Elias turned to Nantan as the clerk finished the last seal. You could stay, he said, voice uncertain. There's more to be done. I need someone I can trust. Nantan looked toward the horizon. My place is with my people, but I'll ride through now and again. Keep the coyotes at bay. He smiled, tired but grateful. I hope you do. They stepped outside into the morning chill. A small crowd had gathered, ranchers, traders, townsfolk. Not a cheer among them, just quiet nods and respectful glances. Prescott had seen 1,000 men pass through, but today it stood still for 2. As Nantan saddled her horse, Mora approached her. You ever need a place to lay low? Mora said. The Gilded Stag's got a corner with your name on it. Nantan nodded. If trouble finds me again, I'll bring it to your door. They clasped hands once, 2 women cut from different cloth, but sewn together by grit. Then, with the wind at her back and the desert calling, Nantan Luyu rode east. Not to escape, but to remember. The cattleman was gone, but his last words had planted something deeper than blood or coin. A legacy. Spring had deepened in the high desert by the time Nantan Luyu crossed back into White Mountain territory. The wind carried the scent of blooming ocotillo, and the stars returned each night like friends who hadn't forgotten her name. She didn't speak much of what had happened, of the dying cattleman, the letter, the shootout in Prescott, but word had a way of traveling in silence. Elders nodded as she passed. Children stopped their games to watch. A girl gone out into the world had returned not just alive, but altered. She carried no gold, no trophies, only a quiet understanding of something larger than vengeance or pride. In the evenings, she would sit near her grandfather's fire, speaking softly with him in their language. When he asked her what she had seen, she said only, "Greed makes men fools, but sometimes Even a fool can leave behind something worth keeping. Back in Prescott, Elias Whitlock was learning to carry the name his father left behind. He kept the land but refused the title of baron. Instead, he opened it to sharecroppers, ranch hands, and families run off from their own parcels by the likes of Hollis. He rebuilt the old barn as a meeting hall and planted mesquite trees where fences once stood. Mora Finch remained his closest ally, running the Gilded Stag with the same silver tongue and iron will. But she sent riders to the range now and then, checking the land, checking Elias, always curious if the boy had turned into the man his father never could. One of the riders, a freckled woman named Tilly, returned one evening with news. "Something stirring out by Black Mesa," she said, nursing a shot of rye. "Old trails cleared. Survey markers up again. Someone sniffing around the Whitlock vault." Elias set down his coffee. "Who?" Tilly shook her head. "Not Hollis men. Different. Military look to him. Don't say much." That night, Elias sat alone in his father's old chair, the fire casting shadows that danced across the deed still nailed above the mantel. The letter, creased, bloodstained, and faded, rested in a frame beside it. He stared at it for a long time before rising, pulling on his coat, and heading out. 3 days later, he rode into the White Mountain camp, dusty and lean. He found Nantan watching the sunrise with her bow across her lap. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "Not bandits. Not rail men. Government." She didn't look surprised. The land always draws them. "I don't want another fight," he said, "but I'll defend what's ours. I need to know if I have allies." She looked at him, her eyes dark and steady. "You brought the fire back to that land," she said. "That means something." He nodded. "I'll ride out at dusk. If you choose to come." "I'll be there," she said, rising with a fluid grace. Together, they stared east toward the mesa. The wind stirred the dust like it remembered what had come before. The canyon walls of Black Mesa glowed with firelight as night fell. Campfires dotted the plateau, not with soldiers, but with cowhands, scouts, and riders who owed nothing to law, but everything to land. Elias Whitlock stood at the center, his coat dark with trail dust, his hand steady on the reins of his father's old gelding. Beside him, Nantan Luyu moved like a ghost through the camp, speaking low to those who needed guidance and silence to those who didn't. The government men arrived at dawn. Their uniforms were clean, their rifles polished. An officer named Granger led them, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, his boots shining like polished stone. "We're here under order of the territorial governor," Granger said, unfurling a document. "Whitlock land is hereby claimed for survey and development in the interest of federal expansion." Elias didn't blink. "That land's been paid for in blood, in ink, and in truth." "Truth," Granger sneered, "is whatever's signed at the bottom of a document." Nantan stepped forward, then let the land speak its own. She raised her arm. From the ridgelines, riders appeared, Apache and Anglo alike. Not soldiers, but defenders. Ranchers, drifters, women with rifles across their backs, old warriors painted for war. Granger's men hesitated. "This ain't your land," Elias said. "It don't belong to the government. It don't belong to cattle kings. It belongs to those who live with it, not above it." Granger squinted. "You'd threaten war?" Elias shook his head. "No, I promise it." The standoff stretched, silent and tense as a drawn bowstring. Then a sound broke it, soft, steady, unmistakable. A drum. From the canyon came the thrum of a single-skin drum, played slow and low. A rhythm older than any nation, deeper than the mines they'd dig. It wasn't music. It was memory. Granger looked at the faces before him. Saw no fear. Saw resolve. And perhaps wisdom. He folded the document. "This ain't over," he said, voice cold. "No," Nantan replied. "But this chapter is." They rode off by noon, dust trailing behind them like a snake slithering back into the grass. Later, as the fires burned low, Elias stood at the vault entrance again. The wind blew across the land, carrying whispers too soft to name. He turned to Nantan. "What happens now?" She looked toward the stars. Now the land breathes, and we guard it. They stood together in silence, the weight of legacy between them not as burden, but bond. In the canyon, the last light faded, but the story did not end. It simply rooted deeper.